Anyway, welcome. Thank you all for coming, and I'm going to be speaking about the aesthetics or an aesthetic approach to the work of George Nakashima. I think we're all used to and know the biography, the basic history of his life and what he accomplished, which was pretty amazing between his birth in 1905 and his death in 1990. But what I wanted to focus on, and I'm going to talk first without slides, so bear with me. I'll try not to put you to sleep, but I'm going to talk for a short time to sort of introduce what it is that we need to be thinking about before we turn to the slides, which are where the fun comes in and we get to look at them and analyze them a little bit. So George Nakashima was one of the great innovators of the 20th century, unquestionably. His popularity and fame, which is now extended beyond the United States to most of the world, is very unlike most American designers. There are almost no American designers. In fact, I'm not sure if there are any others other than Nakashima that have the level of popularity and respect throughout the world that George Nakashima has. The only drawback to that is that there's a lot of his work leaving this country now and going to Europe and other Asia and all over the world. So it's a little bit of a concern to me that we start to lose some of the heritage of this country, but it's nice to have the French, who usually think Americans are all idiots, think that our brilliant George Nakashima is brilliant, in fact, because for many years when I was doing business in France, the attitude was there was really nothing in American design that was worth looking at. Fortunately, that's changing, and I believe honestly that Nakashima has a lot to do with that, and it's extending out now. They're looking at other designers as well. He offered a design approach that was really like nothing that had gone before it. That is, there was no real precursor to George Nakashima. Yes, there were designers doing things that had some similarity. He may have borrowed some ideas from, especially during the Art Deco period and in the Bauhaus period. But he was really doing something that nobody else did, and the main thing that he did that was of at least two relatively incongruous styles of work. That is Japanese vernacular design and American vernacular design. Now, some people think of the American as being shaker, and sometimes he called himself a Japanese shaker. But there were also, and there are pieces of his that definitely show a shaker influence, but there are also a lot of other pieces that show just an early American vernacular design approach. And he took the two, the Japanese and the American, and combined them in a unique way and gave them a modern twist so that they were uniquely of the 20th century. And in so doing, he articulated a completely new design vocabulary that was based on many different things, some of which we'll talk about, but free edges, sapwood, knots, crotch figuring, other natural flaws in the wood, revealing the joinery, butterfly joints, and on and on. I mean, there were just so many different things that became a part of his vocabulary, some of which had been in other periods and times, like butterflies, were not brand new to him. They did have a history. But he combined them in ways that were completely unique and designed things that were completely unique. Now, it's tempting and sometimes really easy to overlook the design aspect of George Nakashima's work. His own words are misleading in some cases because he emphasizes the tree. He emphasizes the second life of the tree. I'm sure most of you have heard that expression. And the second life of the tree as a functional object. And he had a concept that each board had one ideal use. And further, to more complicate matters, because of his a highly spiritual approach to his work, he consistently attempted to extract ego from what he was doing. And despite what really is, as we'll see as I start to show the slides and talk about them, what was really an extremely complex design process. Let me read what he said about his own work. The work is not about me, it's about the tree. It's about nature. On one level, it's true, but on a much more complex level, that is really a very misleading statement, because his work is much about design and about his brilliance in design. In fact, I would say that everything about a Nakashima piece, from the very beginning to the end, is about design. And that means that he supervised the cutting of the boards. When he made decisions about how to cut a board, how to cut a tree, he was making a design decision. That was not just, let's see if we can get a pretty grain. No, there were much more complex decisions being made. And the boards stayed in his head, to the extent that when he made a piece for a client, when they went out and picked a board in the shed and they came inside, he would sit down in 5 minutes and draw that board completely. He would draw the table with the legs, where they were going to be placed, where the butterflies were going to be, where the knots were. In other words, an eidetic memory, I think it had to be an eidetic memory, was such that he could remember every board, but then again, he was there for the cutting of every board, or most of the boards. So that there was a design process at the very, very start, before anybody thinks about design usually. They buy wood from a lumber yard. They don't think about how it was going to be cut. And then he even developed his own oiling system, so that the grain and the beauty of the wood would be brought out. So that's the end process. The beginning process is cutting the board. The end process is the oiling of the board. When people often, and I don't want to say this in a negative way, but there are people who naively, and I guess it is negative, there's no other way to put it, they naively assume that the great Nakashima only means that it was a great board, that it was a wonderful, beautiful piece of wood with amazing grain and all sorts of wonderful features about it. That's really misleading also. It's not what he's all about, as we'll see when we look at some of the slides that I've chosen to show you. With him, we need to focus on his design. We need to focus on the heart and the mind and the hand of the maker. We can't be fooled into thinking, which there is that kind of assumption, that these boards kind of jumped on top of a base and made themselves. Because they do look natural. I mean, they really come off as being quite unique, and they seem normal the way they are. They don't look, very complicated to make. They're much more complicated than they are, as I'll be discussing. And that design process grew and developed during his lifetime, because his work in the 70s and 80s became even more complex and more designed than some of his earlier work. There were other factors, in that he had better wood, and that his daughter Mira came to work with him in 1970 and made a major contribution. So each piece is basically a shaped product. First starts on a piece of paper, then on the boards themselves with chalk or pencil, so that he would be standing there with the client, drawing what he was going to do, where he was going to cut, how he was going to make this thing work. And the quote that I like so much from him about coming back to the issue of the wood and cutting the wood, he said, "Each cut requires judgments and decisions on what the log should become. As in cutting a diamond, the judgments must be precise and exact concerning the thickness and direction of cut, especially through the figures, the complicated designs resulting from the tree's grain." So even he recognized that the hand of the maker was there from the very beginning. And I mean him as the maker, though he also credited a higher power as the maker as well. And in fact, that's why he tried to draw ego out of much of the work. The entire effect that he achieves in so many of the pieces, if not all of them, but there are occasional failures. There are, not very many of them. But it's so balanced that it's really easy to overlook all these decisions that he made. Creating furniture with communicating a sense of being natural to people is a very complicated thing. That is, it's not a simple thing to make a simple piece, because it's really not simple. It's very complicated. And in 2 or 3 minutes, we're going to move to the slides where I think you'll understand what I'm talking about a little better. He was extremely detail-oriented and closely supervised every process of every part of the construction process. He was there all the time overseeing the process. He did not make pretty much anything after the very early years himself. He was not really truly a woodworker, even though he really called himself originally a craftsman artist. And he was more a craftsman artist than he was a woodworker in that sense. He didn't really work the wood. He knew how to do it. He did some of it, but he had at minimum of 5 people and as many as 12 to 14 people working for him. And they also had a shop down the road called the Schattinger shop where they farmed out things that were being done off-site. So the reason they were able to create 35,000 pieces in his lifetime is because there were a lot of people working on this. It wasn't George Nakashima, and I know a lot of people love that mystique that there's this one man who's made this all himself with his hands. There are almost no woodworkers out there who are doing that. It's almost impossible, and it certainly is impossible to make a living doing it. And there are probably a few people here who can attest to that. In fact, I know there are a few people here who can attest to that. Another quote from George, which I really love, is that he said, in the recognition of how important it was what he was doing in the design process, is the error of a fraction of an inch can make the design fail absolutely. Talking about a man who could say a fraction of an inch. You go look at a Nakashima piece and imagine that he could understand that a fraction of an inch could lead to a complete failure. So this was somebody who was really very much aware of the design process. Okay, I want to go to look at the slides now. I could go on and on, but I don't want to do that. Let me see if I can remember how to... Oh, there we go. I'm starting off with something that I wish we could blow it up even bigger, but I'll explain some of the things about it that... This is a set of nesting tables that he made in the 1970s for an architect in Alabama. Of all the things that I have ever seen of George's work, this one more clearly communicates the notion that everything is about design. And one of the things he did was he used teak. And by using teak, if you can look at it, he's actually taken the grain out of this piece to some extent. You're no longer looking at what we all think of as Nakashima, wild grain, holes and all sorts of different fissures and things. No, we're talking about an almost grainless wood, relatively speaking, because he's using that so that the rest of the things that he's doing speak. And if you look at it, the first thing I think that most people usually see on this is the beautiful dovetails. And the end grain creates a contrast in color, and we get these incredible revealed joinery that just is absolutely stunning, not inside a drawer, right on the outside of the piece, to be appreciated. And if you look at it a little more carefully, you'll start to see something at the very bottom. The way it's scooped out creates a certain lightness that wouldn't be there if it weren't scooped out. And more importantly, if you look at that front table, the legs on the front, well, I'll call them legs, it's thicker at the top and it narrows, it gets narrower as it goes down towards the bottom. So he's created a certain lightness in what looks to be a very blocky design by very subtle but extremely important details. Without those, these would just look like a bunch of Parsons tables. which quite honestly I've never really understood why people like Parsons tables, but because they really to me are bland, and this shows you what it could be, and it's an amazing design from my perspective. It's actually down at the Modernism Museum in Mount Dora right now in their Nakashima exhibition. These are on exhibit there. So now I thought, well, let's look at a completely different set of nesting tables. Now we see the grain. Now we see this incredible, beautiful grain in the piece. But at the same time, if you look at the tops of those tables, they didn't just come off the tree like that. They were cut and shaped and formed to create what's called the amoeba tables. So the nesting tables are also referred to as amoeba tables. And the beautiful shaping combined with the grain is what makes these such an amazingly successful design. Another piece that looks really simple, especially when you look at it from the front. It's called the Portsmouth Table. It was done for the Portsmouth Abbey in the 1960s. He did a whole series of pieces for the Portsmouth Abbey in Rhode Island. And if you look at it, as I said, it looks very blocky. Now look at the side view. Two things that you see in the side view. One of them is that there's a reveal on the left and the right. The shelf doesn't end, but he made a conscious decision in all of these Portsmouth tables for that little piece to stick out on the left and on the right. At the same time, if you can see it, it's kind of subtle in this photograph, you'll notice that the board on the side is tapering slightly down from the top down to the bottom. And this is what happens at the bottom. It's really hard to see, but if you can see it, the little scoop out at the bottom. And there's two functions to that. One of them is that it does lighten up the design. The other one is it makes it stand better, because you have two pads basically that it's standing on. So when it's on carpet or it's on floor, hard floor, it still has 2 points on which to stand. Sometimes when it's straight across, it'll rock back and forth. So he was, very sophisticated about engineering, ergonomics, many, many different things. The design process for him was quite across the board. And that's why I really think it's so critical to start to realize how carefully done all these pieces were, and not to get caught up in, which is not bad, because if we go back here, these boards are amazing. They're absolutely gorgeous. The grain of the wood is great. But I don't like to get caught up too much in that, though we'll get caught up in it a little bit more. And this is the top view of the Portsmouth table, where you can see that something I haven't talked about yet is his use of sapwood. Now, sapwood, before George Nakashima came along, for the most part, was completely eliminated. You cut it off the tree immediately. Nobody would use that. That was junk. And people thought he was crazy because he was buying all the junk, all the leftover woods that nobody else wanted. And in fact, that's literally true. From Thompson Mahogany, the owner of Thompson Mahogany, before he passed away, came into the gallery one day and said, we used to sell 12 trees to one person, and 2 of them would be junk, and we'd leave them. And George came in and bought all of them. I think they gave them to him the first time, but there were like 30 trees left over, and they didn't want them at all because they'd already been paid for them. But that's what George wanted to work with. So sapwood to him was a feature of the tree. It was part of the history of the tree. It wasn't to be treated as if it was irrelevant and cut out. And as you can see here, he puts it right in the middle. It's a streak, a beautiful streak, right down the middle that creates a lovely combination with the wood, the American black walnut on each side of it. Now, American black walnut was his wood of choice for the most part, cherry secondarily, and then a lot of other woods after that, but not a lot, but some. And the next slide actually shows English walnut, which is another very subtle design. And in the beginning, you'll notice that I'm picking relatively simple, straightforward designs, because to make this point, I think you've got to see how much work he did that was quote-unquote simple. And this wood grain is just amazing of this English walnut. But if you look at the base, you really can't tell that board that right down the middle does the same thing as the boards I was looking at. It tapers down from the top down to the bottom on the sides, so it gets thinner from the top as it goes down to the bottom, and it also comes in from the top to the bottom. And if you look at the runner on the floor is not just a rectangular piece of wood. It is shaped, and it creates a visual appeal and a visual lightness that you wouldn't have if that board were, just imagine if it were a 2 by 2 inch square or rectangular piece. It wouldn't have the same quality to it. Now the next piece we're looking at, we're getting into a little more complexity here, but it was a piece that I was really excited to discover that I refer to as the Chigi Donna cabinet, and it was done, one of the last pieces that he ever made in his lifetime. And I want to look at it a little bit because it looks, again, relatively simple, maybe a little more complicated than the things we were looking at. And the first thing that happens is that you'll see it's a version of this, his high chest of drawers. This high chest of drawers happens to be somewhat more interesting than many of them because it has a front free edge and it has an overhang on the left and the right. And I don't have any good shots of this, but all of his overhangs are canted. They're cut on an angle. And so when we look at this, we see it's kind of a version of that. But there are a couple of other things that are different. The base is completely different, and the interior, there is an interior. It's not just drawers. The base is the base that he used for the bahut, and the base that he used for the cornblood case. And there's a close-up of it. And as an extended version, it was referred to as the IP base, which was for one of his greatest commissions, the International Paper Commission. And he took that relatively small base that you see on the bahut and the case here, and he turned it into a much larger base for the pieces that he made for International Paper. Now, this introduces something that starts to happen in his career in the late 50s, which is that we start working towards a more architectural basis, more architectural design. And certainly the bases. This one is later. We'll see a lot of bases coming up in the next little while that show you that the direction that he was going in terms of being an architect and bringing his architectural training to bear on furniture design, because we can't leave that out. Now this is the interior at the top. Now what's interesting about this is the form that is a traditional Japanese form called the Chigi Donna. I always say it wrong, but Mira says it right all the time, and I know she's here, but that's all right. It's Chigi Donna, I believe, and this is the one that George designed for Whitacombe in about 1958-59 that Mira made again for a show we did at the Moderne Gallery. And this is the one that she made based on George's design from about 1958-59. So what we have is I just want to go back. It doesn't go as fast as I like, but we're taking this relatively straightforward piece, and I'm dissecting it and showing its relationship to a 1950s chest of drawers, a 1970s base, and a 1958-59 Chigi Donna. And if you see that little piece, that stick up there, there's a stick up in the top. There it is. That's a peeled piece of wood. And what's interesting to me, this is the end of his career, and he's bringing together all these different disparate elements. And one of the things he's bringing in is this. This is the first thing he ever designed, with Noemi Raymond, apparently. Antonin Raymond, he was the architect that hired George in Japan, and this was made for a church. This chair is made from peeled cryptomeria, which is a sacred wood, and the entire church was built out of peeled cryptomeria. And then he designed, or he with the Raymonds designed, these chairs that were in the church. And so it's a very interesting reference to his own early years at the end of his life, and he brings this into this piece. So when I talk about a sort of sophisticated sense of design, he's thinking all the time. He's not just making stuff. Yeah, he was making a lot of things because he was making a living and doing quite well at it. But he was always thinking and always designing. And here's another very straightforward piece, getting into his cabinets for a few moments. Again, most of these things we've looked at are American black walnut. But this case is a unique design. It's from the 1960s, and here's where it really becomes unique. That's a rosewood handle. Now, I'm sure when I saw this, I said, that's probably not Nakashima, because, you know, we're always dealing with the question of whether this is Nakashima or not Nakashima. The documentation is there. It is Nakashima. The original drawing exists. He made, as you can see, he was not afraid to design something that was even out of character. And in this case, you know, it adds something to what's a relatively simple piece, but it also is functional because it allows that door to open out. Where most of his doors are sliding doors, that door on the left opens straight out because it has a handle and you can pull on it. Now, this is a more traditional Nakashima cabinet, but not really traditional because it has this incredible freeform top. And when I said we start to, you know, as we move along, we start to appreciate some of the amazing designs that he did with using freeform pieces of wood. But this one is contrasted so nicely with the very rectilinear grilled, that's pandanus cloth behind the walnut grills. So I refer to it as grilled pandanus cloth doors. Very rectilinear. Everything is rectilinear except for that top. The top is a complete juxtaposition. Preternatural, if you will. I did that for David and Suzanne. It is a complete juxtaposition with what's a very rectilinear design, and there he goes, and this is what happens in so many of the coffee tables that we'll begin to see as we move along here. So I picked a couple of cabinets out that, again, and I've leaned heavily on unique designs, because what happens is that the unique designs that he made helped to reveal his design sensibility. Because when he was making chests of drawers over and over and over again, and they were pretty much the same chest of drawers, the wood was different, and again, many of them were made at the Schattinger shop, not even at his shop. So I picked designs that are often so unique that they really show the hand. And as you can see here, he not only combines the grilled pandanus cloth doors, but he has the fiberglass impregnated paper doors at the back. And what's interesting about that one is that this was designed for a specific commission, and those doors slide open so that you could pass things through from the kitchen to the dining room, as well as the storage underneath. And it also has something else that people would say, well, George never did that. But again, I have the original drawing of this piece. There are pulls, if you can see them, there are little silver pulls. And George was known for not using pulls, except when he needed them, when it was an appropriate thing. Oh, I didn't even point that out in the Chigi Donna piece. There are also little ebony pulls on the drawers in there. And this is another angle view of it, where you get to see the dovetails at the top, and you get to see the sap streak right down the middle. Not that he always put sap streaks down the middle. Most of the time, and we'll see it in a few moments, he had sap streaks on the left and the right side of a dining table or a coffee table, and he employed the sap streaks as a design element. But he oftentimes would put them down the center of a piece. And this is not a single board, by the way. You don't get sapwood down the middle. he had to design this and decide to glue those boards up in order to have that sap streak. Again, another design element, not just a board that he happened to pick up and say, oh, let's use this board. No, it was really a design decision. And here's another piece that's sort of similar. As you can see, it has the sap streak down the side again. This is one of two armoires that I know that he made, and this one he made for somebody here actually in New Hope. And it was beautifully designed on the interior, and it has, as you can see, 3 drawers at the bottom, and it's very shallow. So instead of this becoming a very heavy, clumsy design, which it could so easily be, it's only 16 inches deep. Well, how can you have an armoire that's 16 inches deep? It's because he made it so the clothing would hang this way going towards the back, so that that wasn't hanging the way we normally think in a closet, but it was, he had the bars so it would all hang this way. So you could put 10 or 12 shirts, 5 or 6 suits in each compartment. And the design itself, as a result of that, was incredibly successful when it, as I said, it could have easily been much more than a fraction of an inch off. It had been a 20-inch deep cabinet, it would have been too heavy and clumsy. Now, turning now to looking at a little more of his architectural bases as we move along. This is, as you probably all, or many of you know, is called the Co Nguoi Bench. It's one of the signature George Nakashima pieces. It demonstrates the use of the sapwood at the back edge and the front edge. The board is a single board, which all the Co Nguoi benches that I've ever seen were single board. The seating area was a single board. And of course the piece has that kind of early American Shaker-esque, whatever you want to call it, element because of the back and the spindles. And the legs are very simple. Turned legs, as were most of his early pieces. Now you get to a piece from the 1970s. Everything's different. He has moved into a much more architectural approach to the base, as is very obvious here. Not only that, he changed a lot of things. He put a wooden board on the back and a single board back there. Again, you can see the free sap edge at the top and the free somewhat sap edge at the bottom of the back. But the base itself is so dramatically different from 4 turned legs that it shows the direction that he was going in terms of his architectural background. As do these chairs, which are another of his signature pieces, the Co Nguoi cushion chair, the Co Nguoi chair itself, which are all on runners. They actually owe a small debt to a Bauhaus designer by the name of Heinz and two designers, a husband and wife, Heinz and Bodo Rasch, who actually had this kind of a base on a chair they designed in 1928 or 29. But what we see here is this really architectural base. Again, now we're looking at a yoke back. So now we're looking at a back, the crest rail is now coming with an Asian influence. At the same time as we're still seeing the spindles, which are the American influence. So this combination of the Asian and the American vernacular language is in all of his works and set against a very modernist base. A very early table from the 1940s that again speaks of the very simple combination of simple turned legs and a free-form top. And by the way, this early on in the 40s, there aren't that many pieces with tops that are this free-form. I've seen many pieces that are completely rectilinear, that he didn't even allow the board in those early years to speak for itself. And here's another example from the early 50s, which is I think about when he stopped making this table. That was for magazines to be held underneath it, and it really works. I had it in my apartment, and we moved out of that apartment, but I just absolutely loved it because we always kept our magazines and books stored there. They weren't on top of the table, and it was really functional. It was great. But again, you can see a free-form top set against these simple turned legs. Getting a little more complicated, but not a lot more complicated, we see what I refer to as the bracket base here. The bracket on the left side, in a pretty spectacular coffee table, an amazingly free-form top. Not the most functional at the second half of it because you can't put much down on it. But this is, again, getting a little more architectural, a little more designy when it comes to the base. And here we come to a piece that is partially cut off. I don't know how that happened, but which has those bracket legs, but now the bracket leg is even more pronounced. It's even more of a design statement. And this is a rosewood table. It was absolutely gorgeous in person. I hope it can be seen as well as a slide, with sapwood on the edges and a sapwood streak down the middle. And that contrast of that yellow against the deep, almost reddish black of rosewood was an amazing design element and creates, what again looks to be extremely simple. One other detail, which is not noticeable at first, and in fact I've known people to live with things like this, and then somebody points it out to them, they realize that the ends are curved. So if you look at that carefully, you'll notice that that isn't a straight end. That's a curved end. And George did this in a lot of dining tables that he referred to as boat-shaped dining tables. But in the boat-shaped dining table, it not only lightens the table up, but if you've ever sat at one of those tables, it allows for conversation in a much more normal way because you're not leaning in. Everybody is sort of at a different plane on a boat-shaped table. This case is not to make it because nobody's sitting at a coffee table. This is because it creates a lightness to the design. And one of the things that I think that I've always seen in George's work is there's an elegance and a lightness that is often unexpected when people talk about, these amazing trees and these 2-inch thick boards and all these heavy things. But he manages to make them light and elegant. Now, this moves us into what I wanted to talk about for a moment here, were the butterflies and again the sapwood on the edges of the table. This design is a book-matched tabletop on a very simple base, and you can see the incredible care that was taken to make sure that the butterflies were just the right size, and they really are just the right size. And it just makes for an absolutely gorgeous top. And I'm going to show some more tops a little bit in a few more minutes that I would argue in some cases that George was like a painter, and that his use of the natural fissures and the natural issues that a board had, the sapwood, the use of butterflies, all these things were creating a visual composition that is not all that different from what somebody painting or drawing would be doing. And in fact, we do have to remember that he did draw almost all of these things, even though he didn't get the shop drawings. Mira did most of the shop drawings, or all of them, from 1970 on. But he at least had done sketches of everything, so things started off as a drawing. Another fascinating architectural base, a unique base. I've referred to it as the butterfly base, just for lack of a better name. I think George called it on the original order coffee table. Yeah, no, he referred to it as a 6-foot coffee table, I think. That was it. So that, without a drawing, you have no idea of what he's referring to. It's this beautiful English walnut board set on top of this incredibly interesting base, and a unique base. I've seen a couple of them, but not too many. And speaking of bases, this becomes one of his most admired bases from the Co Nguoi series, and it's referred to, initially he called it the cross leg, and then he called it the Co Nguoi, the cross leg table, and then he called it the Co Nguoi end table. There's another one with a different view of it. Talk about something that is, like a building and like an architectural rendering. This base is really one of the, to my eye, one of the most successful bases that he ever did in that architectural thing, that architectural approach. And here we have a spectacular, I tell you it's spectacular because you probably can't tell from a small slide, but it's a rosewood top, and those legs just become so light and airy and elegant, and it becomes the most perfect bureau plat, just a basic desk with a top, and that's it. And that cross leg is just great. Speaking of great bases and great designs, this is a really rare design by George. I think there are only a handful of them. This was the very first one he ever made. He made it in Japan for a show at the department store there, and he made it for a gentleman by the name of Weatherby. And hence it's called, as in many of his tables don't have real creative names, the Weatherby table. He named it after the person for whom he designed the first one. Many of his pieces are like that. This just has, the top is an amazing English oak burl piece, and as I understand it, he saved these pieces specifically for this, and the base is just such an absolute contrast with that top that it's just a beautiful juxtaposition. Now this looks to be a more, free-form coffee table, but what I want to point out, and let me say this, I do want to say one thing. I'm not showing you a lot of the wild free-form stuff, because that's not what I wanted to focus on. So what I'm showing you are things that, if you look at this top, it's clearly very shaped. It wasn't left just the way it came off the tree. He clearly cut, and you can see he cut in all different places. There's only one true free edge, and that's at the very back. And the rest of it is all shaped and designed. And that's what I wanted to focus on, because that's the part of his career that is often not talked about or thought about. And this one, by the way, and this isn't, I can't really get into it, it's much too complicated, but if you look at the way the base is situated, he found the place that base had to be. The table wouldn't have been able to stand if he didn't put that base on the angle it's at, in the position, at the length it is. In other words, there are maybe 40 decisions that had to be made to make this table, maybe more, when it looks like, again, a board jumped on top of a base. But there are really at least 40 decisions that are being made constantly through the entire design process. Now I want to look at a few tabletops, because as I said, I just want to run through a few of these and be done in a couple of minutes. I want to look at this composition I was talking about. I mean, look at the incredible way he used these two book match boards, which have big fissures. He put in multiple butterflies, which speak not only as a functional, but they speak as a design element. He leaves the sapwood in the middle there, that streak down at the bottom, when there's a butterfly going across it. It is a composition. It is a real painting in my eye. As are the next couple of pictures we're going to look at. This is one end of the table. That's the other end of the table. And these are, this table in particular, I can easily imagine most woodworkers saying, well, we can't do anything with those two book match boards. You can't make a dining table. It's not going to work. It's going to have a big hole in the middle. Didn't stop George. The people who owned it originally it's a 9-foot long table. So they had one person at each of those ends, where it splits apart, and then they were able to get 4 people down each side and 2 people on the other end. And so it was a spectacular and very successful design from boards that most people would have trashed. Wait a second. And just another example of a similar kind of thing. This one, most people see a pair of eyes, and it is just this beautiful composition with those eyes, the yellowish sapwood around those holes, and all of the elements adding up to this beautiful composition. And that takes us to one of the last 2 slides, one of the great compositions of his life, at least in terms of recognition, because it was the cover of the catalog of his 1989 retrospective, and that's a tabletop. And when I first saw this tabletop in person at the Lifschutz house. And it really didn't look, I mean, I looked at this top, and this is where the idea came that these are compositions. These aren't just tables made out of wood. This is much more interesting, much more complicated, and it takes a very sophisticated eye and aesthetic sensibility to be able to do that. And this is the one that really led me, and of course they put it on the cover of the catalog for his retrospective the year before he passed away. And lastly, just another one that brings in a couple of other small points, but this is the kind of thing that George Nakashima took a board that was obviously a larger board, or most likely a much larger board, cut it down in order to accentuate every feature about that piece of wood. I mean, look at the butterfly is perfectly placed, the little sapwood up at the front edge, and if you'll see next to the butterfly there's like a gray looking area, almost look like it's dirty. Well, that was filled with mirrors that he brought back from India with him. And he did this for a short period of time in the 70s. He brought back these little miniature mirrors from India, and he would sometimes find a crevice and place them in the crevice. And this is an example of that. So not only was he not letting the board speak for itself alone, he was manipulating the heck out of this board. He was doing all sorts of things, and I would argue that he did that to most things. It's just that his hand and his eye and his heart were so amazingly pure that he could do it in a way that it made it seem completely natural. Thank you very much.